There is a word that gets used too easily when people try to explain men like Pedro Rodrigues Filho. That word is monster. It is a comfortable word. It creates distance. It draws a clean, reassuring line between what he was and what the rest of us believe we could never become. But that line is not as clear as we would like it to be. And the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho is precisely the story of how that line disappears, slowly, quietly, over years, until a human being becomes something that no longer operates by the rules of human conscience. He was not born a killer in any simple sense. He was born into violence. He was shaped by violence. And at some point, a point that is impossible to identify with any precision because these transformations never announce themselves, the violence that had been done to him became indistinguishable from the violence he chose to do. That crossing, that invisible threshold, is what this story is really about. By the time Brazilian authorities had added up the confirmed murders, the number exceeded 70. By his own account, Pedro claimed the real number was well over 100. He was not ashamed. He was not remorseful. He was, by almost every clinical measure that was ever applied to him, what psychiatrists came to describe as the perfect psychopath. And yet, for years, he walked among ordinary people, worked, spoke, laughed, and loved in his own distorted way, while leaving behind a trail that no one fully understood until it was far too late. This is not a story about how Pedro Rodrigues Filho was caught. This is a story about how he was created. If what you're watching right now unsettles you, that is the correct response. If you want to explore more of these dark psychological portraits, more of these stories about how human beings fall into the deepest shadows of themselves, subscribe to Black Pattern. Leave a comment below telling us what you find most disturbing about a case like this one. And if this video reaches you in a way that other true crime content does not, press the like button. It helps more people find what we do here. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The state of Minas Gerais in Brazil in the 1950s was a world defined by poverty, agricultural labor, and a particular kind of hardness that came from living close to the earth and far from anything that might be called opportunity. It was into this world that Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born on June 17, 1954, on a farm in Santa Rita do Sapucaí. Or perhaps it was October 29th, depending on which account you consult. Even the basic facts of his birth carry a kind of uncertainty that would follow him throughout his life. What is not uncertain is the condition in which he arrived. Before Pedro drew his first breath, his body had already been marked by the man who would become his greatest tormentor. His father, also named Pedro, had beaten his pregnant wife during an argument, struck her so hard, with enough force directed at her abdomen, that the infant inside her sustained a deformity to his skull. When Pedro Rodrigues Filho came into the world, his grandmother, who helped deliver him, reportedly noticed the damage immediately. That slight indentation near his hairline, visible in photographs and interviews decades later, was not simply a physical flaw. According to psychologists and criminologists who would later study his case, it may have represented early neurological compromise, damage that could affect impulse control, emotional regulation, and the brain's capacity to process threat, fear, and consequence. The brain is not destiny, but a damaged brain, raised inside a household of unrelenting terror, is something else entirely. Pedro's father was not a man who simply struggled with anger. He was systematically cruel. He beat his wife with regularity, with the calm confidence of a man who had never once been made to feel that there were consequences for what he did at home. Pedro witnessed this from the very earliest age he was capable of processing anything at all. There is a particular kind of damage that comes from watching a parent be degraded, hurt, and broken, not once or twice in moments of rage, but as a pattern, as the rhythm of daily life. It teaches the child a fundamental lesson about power. It teaches that the world is divided into those who inflict and those who absorb. And it teaches this lesson before the child has the language to question it. What is striking, looking back at Pedro's early years through the lens of everything that followed, is how quickly his psychology began to organize itself around a very specific idea: that violence was justice. Not that violence was wrong, not that violence was to be feared, but that violence, directed at the right target, was the only legitimate response to a world that operated without fairness. This belief did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from watching a father destroy a mother. It emerged from a household where the concept of protection was absent, where authority figures caused harm rather than prevented it, where the man who was supposed to model what it meant to be a human being modeled instead what it meant to be a predator. Pedro did not learn that violence was acceptable. He learned that violence was the language of power, and power was the only thing that mattered. By the time he was 13 years old, something had already shifted beneath the surface. He later recalled feeling, around that age, the first conscious impulse to kill. Not a passing dark thought of the kind that many disturbed adolescents experience and then suppress. A genuine, considered, sustained desire. He reportedly attempted to act on it that same year, allegedly trying to push a cousin into a sugarcane press, a device that would have crushed the boy to death. According to accounts, he stopped himself. But the fact that the impulse arose at all, and that it arose not in response to any great provocation, but as a response to a personal slight, reveals something important about how his psychological landscape had already been configured. He was not developing normally. The emotional architecture that most people build during childhood, empathy, proportional response, the ability to feel another person's pain as real, had been structurally compromised. In its place, something else was forming. A system of grievances. A moral framework so distorted that harm felt like logic. The first murder came at 14. His father had been working as a security guard at a school, a humble job, the kind of work available to a man of his background in rural Brazil. He was accused of stealing food from the school kitchen. Whether the accusation was true is unclear. What is documented is that he was fired, and that the responsibility for that dismissal was understood, in Pedro's mind, to rest with the vice mayor of Alfenas. Pedro took his father's shotgun and walked into the town hall. He shot the vice mayor, and then he walked out. The act was not random. It was purposeful, calculated, and directed. Pedro had identified a target, formed a plan, and carried it out. He was 14 years old. He had not yet been to prison. He had not yet lived in the slums or fallen in with criminals. He had not yet experienced the losses that would follow. He killed because, in his emerging moral system, the killing made sense. The vice mayor had damaged his family. The vice mayor deserved to die. The logic was simple, absolute, and terrifyingly consistent. That consistency is one of the most disturbing features of Pedro Rodrigues Filho's psychology, and it is worth pausing on it because it is the feature that most people fail to fully understand. He was not chaotic. He was not a man who killed in frenzies of uncontrollable rage. He was, from the very beginning, a man who killed according to a code he had written himself, with himself as its sole authority. The code was corrupt, distorted, and catastrophically dangerous, but it was a code, and that made him something far more troubling than someone who simply could not stop himself. After the killing, he fled. He made his way to Mogi das Cruzes in São Paulo state, and there he began a new phase of his life, one that would rapidly accelerate the formation of everything he was becoming. In the slums and informal settlements around São Paulo, Pedro encountered a world that seemed, in many ways, to confirm everything he had already been taught at home. The strong hurt the weak. Authority was corrupt or absent. Justice did not arrive from institutions. If it arrived at all, it arrived from the barrel of a gun. He began robbing drug dens. He killed the dealers he encountered. He told himself, and would later tell anyone who asked, that this was justice, that these were men who deserved to die, who were destroying their communities, who preyed on the vulnerable. And part of what makes his story so psychologically complex is that the Brazilian media, in those early years, was inclined to at least partially agree with him. He developed a reputation. He acquired a name, Pedrinho Matador, Little Petey, the killer. But the picture that name created in the public imagination was incomplete in ways that mattered enormously. Because while Pedro was constructing a public identity as a kind of informal enforcer, a man cleaning up the streets that the police refused to clean, the private reality was already far messier, far less principled, far more revealing of what was actually happening inside him. When a cousin called him weak for borrowing a horse without asking, Pedro tried to crush that same cousin in a sugarcane press. When a man who had made a cousin pregnant refused to marry her, Pedro shot him. These were not drug dealers. These were not rapists. These were people who had humiliated him, who had failed to behave according to his personal expectations, who had in some way diminished him or those he considered his own. The pattern was not vigilantism. The pattern was control. The pattern was a man who had decided, at some foundational level, that he alone possessed the authority to determine who lived and who died, and that this authority extended to anyone who crossed him in any way, for any reason, to any degree. This is the distortion that violence, experienced early enough and deeply enough, can produce. It does not simply make someone aggressive. It can reorganize the entire moral self, replacing the question, "Is this right?" with the question, "Does this person deserve to die?" And when the second question becomes the only question, the threshold for the answer, "yes," drops with terrifying speed. Somewhere in these years, Pedro met Maria Aparecida Olimpia, a woman he called Botinha. He loved her, in whatever way he was capable of love. She became pregnant with his child, and then she was killed by members of a gang who wished to strike at Pedro through her. She was not the first person he had lost, but she was the loss that unlocked something in him that had perhaps been slightly restrained until that moment. His response was not grief in any recognizable form. It was massacre. Together with associates, Pedro descended on a gathering organized by the gang leader he believed was responsible. What took place was not a targeted killing. It was a slaughter. 7 people killed, 16 more injured. This was not justice. This was not even revenge in any coherent sense. This was the behavior of a man who had moved so far beyond the ordinary human capacity for restraint that the death of others had become simply the mechanism by which he processed his own pain. And yet he continued to describe himself as a man of principle. By the time Brazilian authorities finally arrested Pedro Rodrigues Filho in May of 1973, they charged him with 18 murders. He was 19 years old. His response to that number has been widely reported, and it tells you nearly everything you need to know about the psychological state in which he arrived at the courthouse. He was not frightened. He was not contrite. He was offended. 18 was not enough, he told the authorities. The real number was at least 100. He was convicted of 14 murders and sentenced to 126 years in prison. And then he kept killing. Prison, for Pedro Rodrigues Filho, was not an interruption of his violence. It was simply a change of venue. Within the walls of the Brazilian correctional system, he continued to kill, targeting, he claimed, those he considered deserving of death. Rapists, pedophiles, drug dealers, murderers. By his own account, he killed at least 47 fellow inmates, a number confirmed in broad terms by police records, though some accounts place the figure higher. His total sentence eventually rose to over 400 years, a largely symbolic number in a country where the maximum time anyone could actually serve was, at the time, 30 years. What happened inside those prison walls reveals the clearest possible picture of what Pedro truly was. He did not kill solely according to his stated code of justice. There is the account, chilling in its casualness, of an inmate who snored too loudly. Pedro killed him. Not because the man was a criminal who deserved punishment, because he was an irritant. Because in the total sovereignty that Pedro had constructed over his own moral universe, even the disruption of his sleep was sufficient justification for ending a life. There is something in this detail that strips away every narrative, every public myth, every attempt to frame Pedro Rodrigues Filho as anything other than what he actually was. He was not Dexter. He was not an avenger. He was a man for whom the value of another human life had been so thoroughly erased that killing required no more moral weight than any other inconvenience resolved. The code he claimed to live by was a story he told himself, and perhaps told himself with genuine conviction. But it was not the truth of what drove him. The truth was something older, deeper, and more elemental than any code. It was the absence of something that most human beings carry inside them without ever noticing it is there. Empathy, the felt sense that another person's experience is real, that another person's pain matters. that another person's life is not simply a variable in a calculation about your own comfort and desire. Pedro Rodrigues Filho did not have this. Psychiatrists who examined him over the course of his incarceration reportedly described him as the perfect psychopath, though others preferred the language of sociopathy, and a psychological assessment identified paranoid and antisocial traits as the dominant features of his profile. The criminologist Ilana Kasoy, who studied his case in depth, described him as an avenger type, a man who had built his entire identity around his murders, who had, in a real sense, become his own violence and could no longer be separated from it. What happened next with his father belongs to one of the most discussed and also most disputed episodes of his entire story. His father, the original Pedro, the man who had beaten his pregnant wife so hard that his son was born with a skull deformity, was eventually incarcerated himself, convicted of murdering Pedro's mother with a machete. The killing was brutal, methodical, the act of a man with no remaining human restraint. Pedro's mother, the woman who had spent years absorbing his father's violence, died at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her. Pedro, already in prison, learned of what had happened. By his own account, he made a plan, patient and deliberate. He visited his father in his cell. He attacked him with a knife, stabbing him 22 times. Then, according to what Pedro told journalist Marcelo Rezende in a 2012 interview, he cut out a piece of his father's heart and consumed it. His stated reasoning was precise, almost mathematical. His father had stabbed his mother 21 times, so he stabbed his father 22. The heart was consumed as the final expression of a vengeance that no number of stab wounds could fully complete. It should be noted that this account has been disputed. The criminal biographer Ulysses Campbell has argued that Pedro's father did not die in this manner, but rather from a respiratory illness years later. What is not in dispute is that Pedro made this claim, and made it with visible satisfaction, in a nationally televised interview. Whether the act itself occurred as he described, the psychology it reveals, the need to claim it, the pleasure found in the narration of it, is itself deeply illuminating. He was not confessing. He was performing. He was constructing, one more time, the story of a man who finishes what needs to be finished. There is a tattoo that Pedro carried for most of his life, ink pressed into his skin that read, in Portuguese, "Mato por prazer," I kill for pleasure. After his eventual release from prison, he had it covered. He gave interviews. He started a YouTube channel. He spoke calmly, with a clarity of memory that was often unsettling, about the hundreds of lives he claimed to have taken. He presented himself as reflective, transformed perhaps, reformed. But there are details that resist any tidy narrative of redemption, because the tattoo said what it said, because a man who killed an inmate for snoring was not operating from principle, because across more than 4 decades of violence, across rural Brazil and urban São Paulo and prison blocks and transport vehicles and wedding gatherings, Pedro Rodrigues Filho killed with a consistency that did not vary based on the moral status of his victims. What varied was the justification he reached for afterward. After Brazil repealed the decree allowing diagnosed psychopaths to be held indefinitely, and given that the country's legal maximum for any sentence was 30 years, Pedro was released in 2018. He was, by then, a man in his 60s. He had spent the majority of his adult life inside Brazilian prisons. He spoke to journalists, appeared in documentaries, and spoke at times of having found religion. Whether faith had genuinely altered anything fundamental in his psychological structure, only he could have known. And whatever answer he gave would have required some caution, given that the history of his self-reporting was one of consistent self-serving distortion. He was shot and killed on March 5, 2023 in Mogi das Cruzes, São Paulo, the same city to which he had fled as a 14-year-old murderer 6 decades before. 2 men fired from a car. They fled in another vehicle. No suspects were ever arrested. The man who had claimed to have killed more than 100 people died at 68 in a parking lot, struck by bullets he never saw coming. What he had spent a lifetime believing, that he controlled who lived and who died, did not apply when it was his own death being arranged. There is a particular difficulty in telling a story like this one, and it deserves to be named directly. Pedro Rodrigues Filho exists in Brazilian culture as a kind of anti-myth. A villain some people found disturbingly easy to admire, because his stated victims often were guilty of real and terrible things. There is something in the human psyche that responds to the idea of someone doing what the law will not or cannot, someone imposing consequence where consequence has failed to arrive. The character of Dexter, the television fiction who punishes murderers while hiding in plain sight, reportedly drew inspiration from Pedro's story, and the comparison has always been flattering to Pedro in a way that obscures the reality. Dexter was a work of fiction designed to make the audience comfortable with impossible moral premises. Pedro was a human being who killed a man for snoring, who killed for personal insults, who carved a public identity out of a private compulsion and then spent decades insisting the two were the same thing. The psychological portrait that emerges from all available evidence is not of a man tormented by the violence he witnessed and tragically transformed by circumstance into someone who killed reluctantly, driven by a need for justice that would otherwise have gone unserved. The portrait that emerges is of a man who wanted to kill, who felt the desire clearly by 13, who acted on it at 14, who could not stop acting on it for the next 5 decades, and who found, in the moral chaos of the world around him, sufficient material to build a justification that others sometimes accepted. That is what makes this case genuinely disturbing at a level that goes beyond the body count. It is disturbing because the line Pedro crossed is not simply a line between the violent and the non-violent. It is the line between a self that is answerable to others and a self that has decided it is answerable to nothing but its own desire. And that second self does not always announce itself. It does not always wear its history on the surface. It does not always look like what we imagine when we imagine danger. Pedro Rodrigues Filho grew up in a place and a time where the conditions for his formation were everywhere. Poverty, abuse, institutional failure, the normalization of cruelty as a response to cruelty. He was damaged before he was born. He was shaped by a father who had no human model worth following, inside a social environment that provided no adequate alternative. He experienced loss in ways that most people could not survive without severe psychological consequences. And from all of that, not in spite of it but through it, he built a self that was organized entirely around the right to kill. The warning signs were there. They appeared before he ever committed a murder. They appeared in the impulse toward a cousin at 13. They appeared in the way he responded to slights and humiliations with absolute lethal finality. They appeared in the absence of fear, in the absence of hesitation, in the total conviction that his judgment was always correct and always sufficient. Nobody intervened. Nobody could have, perhaps, given the circumstances. But nobody looked either. That is the part of this story that should unsettle us most. Not the crimes themselves, though they are terrible in their scope and their duration, but the years before the crimes, when a human being was becoming something irreversibly dangerous, quietly, in plain sight, in a farmhouse in Minas Gerais, while the world around him was busy with its own concerns. The most frightening thing about Pedro Rodrigues Filho is not the number 100. It is not the decades of killing. It is not even the tattoo or the interview or the YouTube channel or the calm with which he described the texture of his violence to a journalist on national television. The most frightening thing is the boy, 13 years old, feeling for the first time with conscious clarity that he wants to take a life, and finding in everything his childhood had already taught him no reason strong enough to say no. That pattern, the quiet formation of something irreversible in silence long before the world takes notice, is what the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho ultimately leaves behind. Not a lesson about evil as an external force, but a warning about what happens when the conditions that produce violence go unaddressed, when the people who need intervention receive none, and when the internal world of a person in crisis is allowed to harden, undisturbed, into something that will eventually insist on being known. The world failed to look carefully enough at Pedro Rodrigues Filho for 14 years, and then it spent the next half-century counting the dead.